They were born in the backlands of eastern Carolina, two identical daughters whose first breaths entered a world, arranged long before they arrived a world where their names were not recorded in any ledger that mattered, where their bodies were listed beneath their mothers on a planner's inventory like tools or cattle, and where futures were not inherited but controlled. The twins, Eliza and Amari, came into life in the spring of 1815, beneath the trembling rafters of a tobacco barn that the enslaved women used as a birthing space. When the main house was inaccessible, their mother, Rosa, had labored quietly, biting down on the cloth another woman handed her, fighting to keep her groans hidden because the overseer did not like the sound of suffering. He called it weakness, even though the whole plantation depended on the strength that came out of moments like these. The twins were lifted into the world just minutes apart, small and slick, their skin shining beneath the lantern glow, and from the first moment they felt the warmth of their mother's chest. Their hearts beat in sync with hers. Rosa whispered over their tiny heads a promise she could not guarantee, but could not let go of a promise that she would keep them safe as long as she breathed. For 14 years, she kept that promise. The plantation where they lived, situated near the slow waters of the Neuse River, was not the largest nor the richest, yet it was governed by the same logic that defined every plantation from Virginia to Georgia. Human bodies were assets, human bonds were inconveniences, and a woman's motherhood was a condition the owner exploited but never honored. Rosa worked the fields during harvest, procuring barns during winter, and the laundry when the mistress wanted fewer enslaved women within her sight. Her presence was soft but unmistakably strong, and her daughters learned to read the world through the quiet language of her movements. How she positioned her body to appear smaller when the overseer was in a rage. How she widened her stance when preparing to take another blow, so that she would not fall in front of her children. How her hands always found theirs in the dark when the night sounds became too heavy. Eliza and Amari mirrored each other in everything. When one moved, the other shifted. When one thought, the other sensed it. When one hurt, the other flinched. They were, as the field workers said, the light shining from one wick. But by 1829, the soil on the plantation grew tired and the debts of the owner grew heavier. Tobacco had not been yielding as expected, and the bank in New Bern had pressed for repayment. White men in trouble rarely tightened their belts. They sold what they could turn into cash fast, even if what they sold was a mother who had lived her whole life shaping their fields. The day the trader arrived, the air was already thick with suspicion, the kind that only comes when enslaved people sense a shift in the atmosphere. Before anyone speaks it aloud, Rosa tried to hide her trembling hands as she stood behind the other women, the twins hovering close enough that their shoulders touched hers. The trader walked slowly, appraising bodies as though examining livestock, tilting chins, squeezing arms, speaking in numbers instead of names. When he paused in front of Rosa, she lowered her eyes because she knew to look a trader in the face was to challenge the verdict he had already made. The owner, desperate and ashamed yet still clinging to the idea that he was a good man trapped by circumstance, agreed to her sale with a sigh that sounded more like relief than regret. The instant the words were spoken, something inside the twins cracked in unison. They had been told from infancy that families in bondage were fragile structures, subject to the whims of weather, profit, and white decisions. But knowing this truth and feeling it tear through one's chest were different things entirely. Rosa tried to remain steady, tried to reassure her daughters with her eyes, tried to tell them without words that she had survived worse and would survive this too. Yet the tremor in her throat betrayed her. That night she held them for the last time, whispering stories of their grandmother in West Africa, a woman they had never met, but who lived in the rhythm of their mother's voice. She told them they were made of rivers and fire, of memory and endurance, of all the things that cannot be sold even when a body is. She asked them to look after each other, though she knew they always had. When dawn broke, she was led away in a chain gang toward Wilmington, where ships waited to carry slaves inland to markets in Georgia and Alabama. The twins ran until their lungs burned, but the guards pushed them back with the ends of their rifles. As Rosa disappeared among the dust and the sound of metal rattling against metal, Eliza let out a sound that did not feel human. Amari caught her before she collapsed out in the weeks that followed. An eerie quiet settled over the plantation. The master avoided the twins' eyes, while the mistress whispered that grief made young girls troublesome. The overseer watched them more closely, irritated by the silence that clung to them like a storm cloud waiting to break. But the silence was not empty, it was sharpening them. Rosa had raised her daughters to understand not only survival, but strategy, to observe before reacting, to store anger like heat inside a stove and release it only when the moment was right. Without their mother, the world seemed colder. Yet beneath the coldness something else began to grow, a refusal that neither girl could fully articulate, but both could feel. If bondage was designed to break the bonds between loved ones, then holding on to each other became their rebellion. Eliza, always the steadier twin, turned inward first. She spent nights tracing her mother's lessons in the dirt behind the cabin, drawing symbols Rosa had taught them that came from stories older than the plantation itself. She memorized the paths that led through the woods, the bends of the river, the locations where patrollers rarely went. She watched which guards drank too much at night, which dogs slept deepest, which doors on the curing barn never latched properly. Amari, more outwardly fierce, began listening to the murmurs of men who passed through the fields carrying news of rebellions, escapes, and the shifting laws across the Carolinas. She learned which enslaved families had kin in the free black communities of Fayetteville, which boatmen on the river would look the other way for the right price, and which white preachers secretly despised slavery but lacked the courage to say so openly. Together the twins formed a network of knowledge that even the overseer could not sense building under his gaze. By autumn of that year, strange small acts of resistance began to ripple through the plantation. Tools left out overnight vanished and reappeared miles away. A barn door mysteriously jammed during a harvest deadline. A mule the overseer favored escaped its pen and turned up near the river bank, as though guided by invisible hands. The twins never admitted involvement, and no one saw them. Yet the enslaved community began to recognize a pattern, a silent pair of shadows, moving with purpose through the night. Rumors spread that the twins were walking with Rosa's spirit, that their mother's strength had not left but simply changed form. Some believed Rosa had been taken, but her daughters were bringing her justice in the only ways they could. Still, the twins understood that mischief was not the same as liberation, and that grief alone could not protect anyone. What they wanted, what they needed, was a way to find their mother or ensure she survived. Wherever she had been taken, letters were impossible. Money was scarce. Movement was watched. But enslaved people had always mastered communication beyond the eyes of the powerful. Through whispers shared at night fires, through coded songs sung while working rows of tobacco, through messages hidden in baskets and quilts, the twins pieced together the direction of the trader's route. They learned that Rosa had likely been sold at a market in Charleston, then sent to a plantation farther south. Each new detail was another thread they pulled toward a vision they refused to abandon. One day finding her, or ensuring her story did not end in silence. Winter arrived early that year, sharpening the air and slowing the harvest. But inside the twins something pushed forward, unstoppable. They had lost the person who anchored them to childhood, but in the darkness that followed, they uncovered a strength that had always lived beneath the surface. The system that tore families apart expected grief to make enslaved people obedient, softened, broken. Yet the twins discovered the opposite in themselves. Their grief was a blade, not one meant for violence, but one forged for precision, cutting through fear and replacing it with purpose. They no longer whispered their mother's name with trembling. They spoke it with resolve. Rosa, taken. Rosa, sold. Rosa, still alive somewhere beyond the borders drawn by men who owned nothing but believed they owned everything. Owned everything. As the year edged toward its end, the plantation entered its usual season of scarcity. Food rations shortened, clothes thinned, tempers flared. The twins, however, began to sense something shifting beneath the routines of daily survival. Other enslaved people had started coming to them quietly, seeking guidance, asking what the girls knew, asking how to endure the losses echoing through their own lives. Eliza and Amari had not set out to lead. Leadership had found them through suffering, and though they were only 14, their eyes carried a weight far older. They understood that everything in their world, every lash, every sale, every attempt to break them was part of a system that feared people like them gaining clarity and unity. If they could not bring their mother back, then they would honor her by refusing to bend. And somewhere deep within both of them, a new question formed, one that would shape the path ahead. If the world could take so much from them, what could they take back? Their answer had not yet taken full shape, but the seed was planted. And once planted, it began to grow. The morning after their mother was taken south carried a weight unlike any dawn the twins had ever known. It felt as though the sun itself struggled to lift above the pines, its rays dimmed by the heaviness that had settled over the Carolina plantation. For the twins, Isaiah and Elias, the world had reshaped overnight into something narrower and sharper. a place where every corner seemed to hold a memory of their mother's hands, her voice, the warmth she had used to place between them, and the cruelty that hovered just outside their reach. But the rules of the fields never softened for grief, and before either boy had fully awakened from the night's restless half-sleep, their names were called with the same cold efficiency as always. They stepped out into the yard, older by years though only hours had passed, and found themselves facing the familiar lines of laborers preparing for the fields, each person carrying their own quiet burden. The overseer watched the boys with a brief and almost invisible smirk, as if acknowledging some unspoken truth. They had no shield now, nothing left to lose, and therefore everything to fear. But despite the weight of their sorrow, the twins discovered something else stirring beneath their grief, something brittle and sharp-edged that neither boy had ever felt so openly before. They had grown up hearing stories whispered in the cabins at night, stories about families torn apart, about sons who tried to run, about mothers who hid their babies under floorboards, about brothers who struck back only to be whipped until their spirits broke. Their mother had always insisted that such stories were warnings, not blueprints. But now that she was gone, those same stories took on the shape of possibilities, hints of what people might do when pushed to a place beyond fear. In the fields, surrounded by the drone of cicadas and the creaking of wooden tools, Isaiah worked with a strange intensity, as if each swing of his hoe carved deeper into the earth than before. Elias worked more slowly, his movements careful, measured, calculating, his eyes drifting toward the tree line again and again, as though trying to read patterns in the shadows. Neither spoke, because words felt too small for the size of what they carried, but their silence bound them more strongly than any conversation ever could. As days passed, the plantation shifted around them in subtle ways that reflected their loss. Some of the older women brought them extra cornbread at night, setting it beside them without comment. Some of the men watched them more closely, sensing the tension building inside the boys, recognizing that dangerous age when grief becomes defiance. A few quietly warned them to tread carefully, to swallow rage rather than let it spill into the wrong eyes. But such advice rolled off the boys like rain on a tin roof. They heard it, but it didn't change the storm gathering in them. Their mother had been their compass, the one person whose presence kept them tethered to the thin but essential belief that survival was still a form of resistance. Without her, the idea of simply enduring no longer felt like enough. Something had been taken from them that could not be returned. And so the world began to tilt toward a different kind of aim, one sharper and more dangerous. Late at night, when the cabin settled into a hush broken only by the croaking of tree frogs and the shifting breaths of sleeping bodies, the twins lay awake listening to the older men talk in low voices about routes leading north, about names of marshes too dangerous for patrols to follow, about traders known for bribery, about coded marks carved into trees. Isaiah listened with a restless hunger, imagining escape as a kind of promise that hovered just beyond reach. Elias, meanwhile, listened with a different sort of hunger, one rooted not in distance, but in proximity, imagining ways to weaken the system from the inside, picturing every vulnerability in the routines of the overseer, every lazy habit of the master's sons, every blind spot in the patrols that circled the property. Together, they absorbed these conversations like students studying a map, each boy shaping ideas the other didn't fully know, but somehow felt through instinct. Their grief sharpened further when a traveling trader arrived, bringing with him the kind of stories that always floated between plantations, rumors of rebellions in the swamps, of runaways forming bands that stole from plantations at night, of a woman who had reportedly killed a trader with his own iron buckle when he tried to separate her children. These tales were likely exaggerated or twisted through retellings, but for the twins, they acted as sparks landing on dry tinder. The idea that people like them had pushed back, had seized even fleeting moments of control, filled Isaiah with a daring he had never allowed himself to imagine. For Elias, the stories planted something colder, a conviction that the structures around them were made by men, and therefore could be unmade by men. Their mother had taught them to survive, but these stories suggested that survival could evolve into something else: a refusal, a disruption, a chance to force the world to feel even a sliver of the pain they felt. Weeks passed, and the plantation grew restless with the coming of summer storms. The air grew thick, buzzing with insects and tensions both natural and human. One evening, as lightning flickered faintly behind distant clouds, Isaiah caught sight of the white men on horseback speaking with the overseer. Their expressions were hard, and though the boys couldn't hear the words, they recognized the posture of men discussing purchases. A sickening possibility rippled through them. They were old enough now, strong enough to fetch a decent price, and with their mother gone, they no longer had any ties that might keep them anchoring the plantation's workforce. The threat of being sold south into the deep cotton empire, where brutality was even more relentless, pressed against their ribs like invisible hands. The very thought of being separated, of losing each other as they had lost their mother, ignited a quiet, urgent panic. That night, lying in the cabin's dim light, the twins understood something with perfect clarity. If they did nothing, the world that had taken their mother would take them next. They could already feel it moving toward them, slow and inevitable, like a river rising after heavy rain. The idea of running had always seemed vast, too dangerous, but now staying seemed equally dangerous, just slower. Elias whispered a thought into the dark, not a plan, just a recognition that the future now held only the possible shapes, one where they acted, and one where they were acted upon. And Isaiah, heart pounding, realized that his brother was right. Their mother's absence carved a space inside them, a void that could swallow them whole if they let it, or could be filled with something else: courage, desperation, willingness. Whatever they chose, the world would no longer allow them to remain unchanged boys. In the following days, the twins paid closer attention to the rhythms of the plantation, not as workers resigned to labor, but as observers studying the weak joints in a structure meant to control them. They noticed when the overseer drank too much and wandered off early. They noticed which patrol routes doubled back and which didn't. They noticed the key that hung from the overseer's belt, the one that opened the small storehouse where the firearms were kept. They noticed the gaps in the fence line where storms had weakened the wood. One night, a storm swept in with winds strong enough to rattle the cabins. In the flickering lightning, Elias saw the fence sway and realized it wouldn't take much for part of it to give way entirely. That detail lodged in his mind like a seed waiting to sprout. Despite all these observations, the boys remained outwardly calm, performing their tasks as expected, blending into the daily grind. It was essential to remain unseen, to let their grief mask their growing purpose. But internally, something irreversible had begun to form, a shared resolve, shaped by loss, fear, and the faint but fiercely burning hope for a life where their futures belonged to them, and not to the whims of traders and masters. They carried their mother's lessons with them, her warnings about rash decisions, her insistence on survival, but they also carried her strength, her quiet defiance, her belief in their worth. That combination, rage tempered by memory, grief sharpened by observation, became the force shaping their every choice. As the plantation edged deeper into the oppressive heat of late summer, the twins sensed that a breaking point was coming. It hummed in the air like the static that precedes lightning. Every night they lay awake, breathing in the thick scent of pine and soil, listening to the murmurs of the others, waiting for the world to shift in a way that would open a path. They didn't know yet what form that path would take: escape, sabotage, confrontation, but they felt themselves moving toward it like iron pulled toward a magnet. And somewhere in that restless tension, in the quiet cabin where shadows stretched long across the dirt floor, the first outlines of a plan began to take shape, born not from desperation alone, but from the memory of a mother who had filled them with more strength than the world had ever meant them to have. The months that followed became a long, grinding test of endurance for the twins, a slow hardening of their resolve as they learned to navigate a world suddenly stripped of every softness their mother once placed between them and harm. The plantation did not change on the surface. Cotton rows still shimmered under the Carolina sun. Overseers still paced with measured suspicion, and the master's book still reflected profit rising from the backs of the enslaved. But for the twins, every detail of daily life had shifted, as if they were now moving through a house whose doors had all been slammed shut at once. The absence of their mother was not a silence, but a weight pressing on every hour, teaching them to grit their teeth when the overseer barked too close, teaching them to hold their shoulders steady when they were separated into different work crews, teaching them to hide grief behind still facial expressions that would not draw retaliation. They became watchful in a way children rarely are, not out of fear, but out of an instinct that their survival now required a new kind of intelligence, the ability to interpret danger, to sense patterns, to read the rhythms of the people who controlled their fate. And in the middle of this transformation, they also began collecting the quiet evidence left behind by their mother's life, fragments of whispered lessons she had given them about reading the world, memories of the route she used to carry water between the quarters, the quiet corners where she once rested her feet, the places where she hid small scraps of paper she saved but never explained. These fragments were not sentimental. They were instructions, and the twins clung to every one of them. Slowly, they pieced together the truth that their mother had spent years preparing for a day she never voiced out loud. Some enslaved mothers found ways to protect their children through silence, others through subtle rebellion, others through patient planning. The twins were beginning to realize that theirs had done all three. As they retraced her routines, they noticed how she had mapped the plantation in her movements, never walking the same path twice, always shifting her pace depending on who watched, always positioning herself so she could see both the main house and the fields at once. They remembered her casual questions. Which way does the river bend? Or what do the pine trees sound like on a windy night? Questions that seemed harmless at the time, but now emerged as coded training about orientation, distance, timing. It was as if she had been preparing them for a moment when she would no longer be there, shaping them to navigate the world without her shadow guiding theirs. In that realization came the first ember of anger, not the wild, reckless anger that leads to ruin, but a slow, disciplined flame that builds purpose. The plantation had taken their mother, but their mother had left them the tools to resist the way she had once resisted, quietly, subtly, with long foresight rather than impulsive force. As the seasons shifted toward autumn, their responsibilities changed, granting them new vantage points over the plantation's inner workings. The boy was pulled into carpentry tasks near the barn, close enough to overhear repairs being discussed between overseer and master. The girl, skilled with her hands, was sent to assist in the dye shed, where older women whispered about the movement of traders passing through the region. In these spaces the twins learned what was never meant for them, debts the master owed, rumors of new markets opening in Georgia, small hints about traders who traveled with only one guard, and a constant reminder that enslaved bodies were treated as fluid assets, moved, bartered, sold when convenient. Every conversation reinforced the fragile reality of their existence. They could be separated at any moment, sold in opposite directions, erased from each other's lives the same way their mother had been erased from theirs. This fear did not break them. It bound them tighter. They began to meet in the early dark, sitting by the edge of the quarters where the pine roots curled above the earth, like gripping fingers, quietly sharing everything they had learned. What they created in those nights was not a plan yet, but a system, a way of combining their observations into a map of vulnerabilities on the plantation. They guessed at shift changes, memorized the overseer's temper, counted the supply wagons that left for town each Thursday, tracked which dogs were alert at night, which slept too deeply to notice movement. They had no illusions about the danger. They simply understood that knowledge was the only tool they possessed, and possibly the only one that could save them. One evening near harvest, while the quarters settled into weary quiet, a traveling preacher arrived, one of those itinerant men who moved from plantation to plantation under the guise of religious instruction, but often brought with them news from beyond the borders of each enclosed world. His sermon in the clearing was typical on the surface, heavy with promises of deliverance deferred to another life, a message encouraged by the master because it kept people docile. But after the formal gathering dispersed, the preacher lingered near the well, speaking differently when no white ears were present. He mentioned freedom seekers who had passed through the Piedmont that summer, told of a woman who leaped off the auction block in Fayetteville and vanished before dawn, spoke of enslaved men in Wilmington who had begun moving in groups at night to share information about patrol routes. These stories traveled like sparks, catching quickly among those with enough courage to believe possibility existed somewhere beyond the horizon. For the twins, the preacher's words landed with particular force. Though he did not mention their mother, every story of escape called her memory back into the clearing. They listened, absorbing each detail not as encouragement, but as data. When he described the woman from Fayetteville running through swamp water to mask her scent, they memorized the technique. When he described night skies along the river, they made note of the star positions he referenced. When he spoke of the way enslaved people passed messages through coded hymns, they recognized some of the songs their mother once hummed in rhythmic patterns, realizing she had been part of a larger, quiet resistance network all along. The preacher's visit marked a turning point because it introduced the twins to a realization that had lingered unspoken between them. Their mother might not be lost entirely. Perhaps she had been sold far away. Perhaps she had escaped. Perhaps she was carving some new path through dark woods under unfamiliar constellations. The truth was unknowable, but the possibility itself altered everything. Instead of imagining her swallowed by some distant market, they began imagining her moving, walking, surviving, fighting somewhere in the same world they still inhabited. That shift filled their nights with a new restlessness, a hunger to act, not blindly, but with the kind of careful strategy their mother herself embodied. They knew they could not simply run. Escape attempts without preparation led to swift, brutal reprisals, not just for the individuals, but for everyone connected to them. They needed timing, cover, knowledge, allies, and above all a reason strong enough to risk punishment, separation, or death. That reason came unexpectedly, delivered by the master's own voice. In late winter, when he announced to an overseer speaking loudly enough for those bending in the dirt to hear that he was considering selling off excess stock before spring planting. No names were given, but the implication was clear. The twins' fate was no longer stable, and the danger of separation loomed close in the days that followed. Fear spread through the quarters as people waited for the trader's wagon to arrive, counting their own chances of being torn from family, measuring the fragility of the bonds they had worked years to sustain. The twins felt something beyond fear, something sharper, more directed. If they waited passively, they could lose each other the way they had lost their mother, and the thought hollowed their chests with a cold, metallic certainty. They remembered every whisper the preacher had shared, every coded lesson their mother had embedded in their childhood, every observation they had gathered about the plantation's routines, and the sense of helplessness they once felt began to collapse under the weight of purpose. They were not naive. They understood escape, resistance, or even small acts of defiance carried immense danger. Small acts of defiance carried immense danger. The master had the law, the patrols, the dogs, the guns, and the wealth to pursue anyone who fled. But he did not have what their mother left them, an inherited knowledge of movement, silence, timing, and the moral clarity that comes only from losing something irreplaceable. As the trader's arrival drew closer, announced by rumor, anticipated by dread, the twins finally realized they had reached the moment their mother had been preparing them for. Their next choice would determine not only whether they stayed together, but whether they would continue to live under the same suffocating force that had tried to crush their mother's life. And as the sky darkened into the long shadow of early evening, they understood that the only way to honor her was not to endure but to act. The weeks that followed moved with the heavy stillness of midsummer heat, as though the air itself understood the danger the twins now lived under. Word had begun to circulate across the plantation that someone had interfered with the broker's plans, and the overseers, hungry for control and eager to show vigilance, walked the grounds with a sharper eye. Yet beneath that tightening net, the twins moved with a newfound resolve, carrying with them the memory of that hidden ledger, the whispered name of the broker, and a quiet promise they had made to hold on to their mother's truth until the right moment forced it into the open. For the first time in their lives, their fear fed their purpose, not their submission. But purpose in those years was a fragile blade. One misstep, one overheard whisper, one wrong set of eyes watching them lingered along in the wrong place could shatter everything. They had grown used to danger since the night their mother had been taken. Yet this danger felt different, heavier, more treacherous, like a road that narrowed the farther they walked it. With no clear end in sight, they began to listen more carefully for anything: names, rumors, arguments behind half-closed doors. Plantation life was a web of overheard fragments and hidden meaning, and the enslaved had always survived by listening to what the powerful never meant them to hear. Some days, the twins worked separately, each slipping into different corners of the estate as if by chance, learning to fold themselves into silence and invisibility. Other days, they maneuvered together, knowing that their likeness to bodies nearly identical in face. Ephraim helped them confuse the eyes of those who watched them. The overseers, trained to treat the enslaved as labor rather than individuals, rarely bothered to distinguish one twin from the other unless punishment was involved. That carelessness became a small, sharp tool in the twins' hands. It allowed them to move with a freedom they should not have had, to appear into places at once, and to let suspicion fall in the wrong direction when necessary. They understood this was both protection and risk. If anyone realized they were using their resemblance as a shield, the consequences would be swift and merciless. Still, they kept going, driven by the memory of their mother's eyes filled with both fear and fierce defiance on the day she was led away. As the summer deepened into late July, something shifted in the air beyond the fields. Plantation owners across the region had become increasingly wary after a series of small, scattered incidents runaways found with forged travel papers, whispers of abolitionist pamphlets entering the countryside, and one violent revolt in another part of the state that had left landowners shaken and furious. Retaliation followed swiftly, with patrols tightened and new rules imposed. The enslaved felt these changes long before they were spoken aloud. The nights grew more dangerous. The woods felt heavier with the sound of distant riders. These tensions, though frightening, gave the twins their first glimpse of leverage. When fear enters a powerful man's house, he tends to guard the wrong doors, leaving others slightly open. The plantation's master spent more time in the main house, locking away valuables, guarding papers, and arguing with neighboring planters about patrol routes and collective punishment. In the confusion, certain habits slipped. Servants were rushed, conversations were louder, and letters were left open on desks while the master stormed out mid-sentence. The twins recognized this shift instantly. Moments of disorder were rare gifts, and they began to watch for openings with renewed vigilance. One sweltering afternoon, while delivering washed linens to the main house, one twin noticed a door left halfway open the master's study. The room had always been forbidden, a place where the estate's deepest machinery operated, contracts, inventories, banknotes, and the unspoken arithmetic that decided fates. The master's voice drifted faintly from the porch outside, arguing with a neighbor about rising tensions. Normally, the twin would have walked past without so much as lifting her eyes, but something inside the room caught her attention. A ledger lying open, its pages weighted by a silver letter opener. She paused only for a breath, knowing hesitation itself could be dangerous, then slipped silently inside, keeping her steps feather-light on the wooden floor. The open page listed numbers and names, most of them related to labor counts and cotton output. But near the bottom, a familiar name appeared, her mother's. Seeing it in ink, reduced to a line of value and exchange, sent a wave of cold through her chest. Next to the name were figures far higher than expected, suggesting that the master had undervalued her mother on paper documents, but recorded her true selling price privately. This discrepancy could mean everything. If the master had misrepresented her mother's sale to avoid taxes, fees, or scrutiny from his creditors, it could expose him to serious legal risk. Just as she leaned closer to commit every detail to memory, a floorboard groaned from the hallway. She froze. The master's footsteps approached, heavy and irritated. There was no time to flee. Her only option was to vanish into the room's shadows, a skill she and her twin had learned since childhood, how to make their bodies smaller, their presence quieter, blending into corners as though they were part of the wall itself. When the master entered, he barely glanced around. He muttered about disloyal hands and outside agitators while shuffling through papers, unaware that one of the very people he feared was inches away in the room's dimmest corner. He left moments later, slamming the door and locking it behind him, trapping her inside. Panic began to rise, tightening her throat. Being caught in the study would mean immediate and brutal punishment, perhaps even sale. But she forced herself to remain calm. She knew that panic led to noise, and noise led to discovery. Slowly, she scanned the room, searching for another exit, but the windows were latched from the inside with iron hooks too high to reach. Her only hope was the small servants' passage that connected the study to a storage room. It was rarely used, nearly forgotten, but still functional. She had passed its narrow threshold once as a child while running errands for a house servant. With careful steps, she crossed the room, slipped into the hidden passage, and navigated its cramped corridor until she re-emerged behind the kitchen. Covered in dust, but unseen, she returned to the quarters before anyone realized she had been missing. When she told her twin what she had seen, every number, every notation, the information struck them like a sudden change in weather. For the first time, they had proof that their mother's sale was marked by dishonesty more than cruelty alone. Her value had been manipulated, her sale disguised, and the master had kept the surplus hidden in private accounts. This discovery transformed their mission. It was no longer just about finding their mother's whereabouts. It was about uncovering the corruption that had swallowed her. That corruption could be turned against the master if they were careful enough, courageous enough, and patient enough to avoid drawing suspicion. With the ledger's figures burned into memory, they now knew that their mother's sale had been part of a larger network of exploitation, involving not just the master, but the broker who had manipulated younger enslaved women for his own profit. This tangled web of deceit meant danger, but it also meant opportunity. The more complex the wrongdoing, the more vulnerable it became if even a single thread was pulled hard enough. As the weeks unfolded, the twins deepened their quiet investigation, always aware that discovery would mean ruin. They learned that the broker traveled frequently between Charleston and Fayetteville, ferrying people, money, and secrets along the same routes traffickers had used for decades. They heard whispers that he kept a small house outside the city, a place where contracts were negotiated, debts settled, and newly arrived enslaved people assessed before being dispersed into the interior. If their mother had passed through that house, there might still be records, witnesses, or traces the twins could find. But reaching Charleston was impossible without resources, planning, and the help of someone outside the plantation's walls. The plantation's enslaved community had always operated with a quiet, unspoken solidarity, a network of shared hardship and whispered risk. People moved information like passing bread in the night, small pieces, carefully broken, but enough to sustain survival. Through this network, the twins began to hear about a free black carpenter who sometimes did repairs on the nearby plantation and had connections that stretched farther than most realized. It was said he had once lived in Charleston and knew the city's back alleys and hidden economies. His visits were rare and brief, but predictable. The twins decided they would need to find a way to speak to him, even if it meant stepping outside the strict boundaries that governed their lives. If there was anyone who could point them toward the broker's hidden world, it was him. But just as they prepared to make their first quiet move toward finding an ally, the plantation erupted in unexpected chaos. A group of enslaved men attempting an escape had been caught near the river by patrol riders, and the overseers responded with violent retribution meant to terrify everyone into submission. The twins witnessed the aftermath from a distance, bodies broken, names erased, the night carrying a sharp cry of pain and the dull ache of fear. The punishment felt like a message directed straight at the twins' growing courage. Danger was closing in. The master and overseers were on high alert, but the twins also understood something deeper. Whenever the powerful lash out, it is because they feel something slipping from their grasp. And if something was slipping now, then their moment, however risky, might soon come. The brutality hardened their resolve. They could not afford hesitation. Their mother had survived her own impossible moment. Now it was their turn to continue what she had begun. But they would have to move with the precision of shadows and the patience of growing roots, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And as the first cool nights of early autumn approached, bringing with them the faint rustle of turning leaves, the twins understood that the next steps in their journey would demand more than courage alone. They would require alliance, strategy, and a willingness to risk everything, because the path ahead was about to twine together with others who had their own battles against the same hidden powers that had taken their mother. They had stepped into the current. Now it was beginning to pull them forward. The months after their first act of resistance settled over the twins like a long and restless season, a kind of winter without frost, but filled with the same sharpness of uncertainty, where every choice felt like the cracking of ice that might give way beneath their feet. Elias and Ezekiel learned quickly that defiance was not a single moment, but a discipline, a slow-burning oath renewed with every insult, every command, every reminder that their mother was gone and that the world was built to keep her gone. They carried that knowledge like a weight strapped beneath their skin, and yet it did not bend them. It sharpened them. Something in them, something formed in infancy as they shared breath and heartbeat. Something their mother had once whispered into their sleeping curls held them firm. That bond became a private sanctuary, a place where despair could not root, because each brother saw himself reflected in the other, and in that reflection they recognized the stubborn pulse of their mother's will. They worked their assigned fields with outward obedience, but watched the plantation with an inward vigilance, memorizing rhythms, noting roots, studying weaknesses. And as they did, the idea that had been planted in Section 4 quiet, dangerous, impossible began to grow into something that could no longer be ignored. Their mother's name became a kind of compass, pointing them toward a future that was still hidden but undeniably calling. Each time they whispered it to themselves in the dark, Kamara steadied them, as if she were still threading her fingers through their hair, reminding them that the world meant for them to bend, but she had not raised them to fold. Word of where she might have been taken came in fragments, drifting through the quarters like seeds on wind. A traveling peddler had passed through, speaking of an auction in Wilmington. A field hand who had once worked further south claimed a woman matching Amara's description had been sent toward a rice plantation closer to the coast. Still another visitor suggested she had been sold westward altogether. The contradictions were painful, but they also kept hope alive, because none of them were definitive enough to close the door. That uncertainty became the fuel for the plan the twins began to carve from the edges of their fear. To search for Amara outright would have been suicide, and they knew this. The patrols, the dogs, the night riders, every element of the system was designed to snuff out such thoughts before they could even be spoken into existence. And yet the twins persisted in their quiet preparation. At night, After the quarters settled into uneasy sleep, they would slip beneath the floorboards of the old smokehouse, a place nearly forgotten by the overseer, but still accessible through a loosened plank by the well. There, by the dim flicker of a stolen candle stub, they worked through possibilities, routes that curved around the river, paths that threaded through pine forests where patrols rarely went, abandoned tobacco sheds where travelers once hid to escape storms. It was a geography of hope, drawn not on paper, but in the oral map that Elias and Ezekiel built between themselves. Through whispered strategizing, they spoke no grand declarations, no reckless promises, only quiet, methodical planning, the kind that grows over many nights like moss gathering on stone. Yet their preparation remained shadowed by the knowledge that the world they lived in allowed no missteps. Their first act of resistance, refusing the overt cruelty of the new overseer, had not gone unnoticed, even if it had not been punished as harshly as expected. Elias's injuries lingered longer than he let on, and Ezekiel's swollen hands were a constant reminder of how easily their lives could be shattered. The overseer's gaze lingered on them now with a new suspicion, a tightening of the leash around their daily movements. Tasks once done in quiet corners of the property were now supervised, and breaks once tolerated were now timed. They understood the message well. One more misstep, and even the slightest whisper of freedom would be crushed out of them. But the overseer did not understand twins, nor the depth of the connection forged through shared suffering. What he saw as control only made their resolve grow more disciplined, more cautious, more certain. The shift in oversight forced the twins to adjust their approach. Instead of studying the plantation by wandering its edges, they began memorizing it through repetition, each footstep ingrained, each sound cataloged. A crow's call at dusk became a clock. The creak of the sawmill's wheel became a direction marker. The smell of smoke from the big house's kitchen at certain hours became a sign of change in the wind. The natural world offered them signals where man-made surveillance tried to blind them. Even the enslaved community, though not privy to the full shape of the twins' intentions, began quietly aiding them through acts small enough to remain beyond suspicion. A lookout who coughed twice if a guard approached. An elderly woman who taught them how to navigate by the feel of moss rather than sight. A boy who had once run messages for the overseer and knew which nights the patrols rotated toward the river instead of the woods. It was not rebellion in the open sense. It was the kind of soft resistance that lived beneath the daily terror, weaving people together in ways the overseer could not detect. But that shaped the possibility of survival. As plans grew clearer, the twins realized there would need to be a catalyst, an event that shifted attention away from them, a moment when the plantation's strict routines were disrupted, enough for them to slip into the world beyond without immediate pursuit. And that catalyst arrived in the form of a late summer storm. For days the sky had hung heavy with heat, the kind that sits on the body and makes every breath feel weighted. Then, on a night that hummed with the electric promise of a coming storm, thunder rolled across the Carolina hills like a war drum. The overseer barked orders for the livestock to be secured and for the barns to be checked, scattering the usual patterns of supervision. Rain cracked open from the sky in sheets, flooding the low paths and forcing the patrollers to take shelter instead of roaming. For the first time in months, movement across the plantation was governed not by the overseer, but by weather. A shift that created small pockets of vulnerability in the system. The storm, however, did more than produce opportunity. It also unearthed fear. Lightning struck one of the old tobacco sheds near the tree line, setting it ablaze. Shouts erupted from the quarters as enslaved men and women were forced out into the storm to help control the fire. Flames clawed at the dark sky, casting wild shadows that turned the fields into a chaotic tapestry of flickering silhouettes. And in that turmoil, Ezekiel felt a tightening in his chest, not panic, but recognition. This, he realized, was the kind of night change could hide within. But Elias saw something else, the danger of acting too soon. Their plan, though prepared in pieces, still lacked one essential element. They did not yet know with certainty which direction their mother had been taken. Escape without that knowledge would turn their effort into wandering, and wandering could become death. Wandering could become death. In the days after the storm, rumors spread again, new ones, this time more credible. A man named Jonah, who had passed briefly through the plantation after being hired out from a property closer to the coast, spoke of a woman who fit Amra's description almost perfectly. She had been seen near the river port, assisting in a small kitchen for men preparing shipments. Jonah described her with care, unsure of her name, but mentioning a soft scar near her left wrist, the same one she had received years earlier while cutting cane. The twins listened with a stillness that masked the tremor swelling inside them. This was the first time something resembling a real lead had surfaced, a direction grounded not in speculation, but in witness. Yet Jonah's information also came with a warning. The port was heavily patrolled because it had become a common crossing point. For those attempting escape, anyone traveling toward it without permission faced immediate scrutiny, and anyone caught attempting flight was subjected to punishments that spread like whispered nightmares through the enslaved community's whippings. So severe bones showed, iron collars fastened with bells that rang with each movement, branding on cheeks or shoulders to mark the crime, or, in the harshest cases, sail far south into sugar fields where survival was nearly impossible. The twins absorbed this warning not as deterrence, but as a measure of the risks. They were already prepared to accept the next phase of their plan required patience, and so they waited not idly, but with the tense purpose of hunters watching the forest for a single sign. They returned to their routine outwardly, but everything now revolved around finding the correct night, the correct hour, the correct shift in the plantation's rhythm. Over those weeks, their bodies grew leaner from stress, their eyes sharper, their instincts more attuned. Their nights in the hidden smokehouse became both strategy sessions and quiet moments of remembrance reflections on their mother's voice, the warmth of her hands, the lesson she had taught them long before they understood the stakes of the world. In those moments, the rage that had once burned hot began cooling into something more focused, more useful. Not a flame, but a blade. Elias, often the more cautious twin, spent much of this time studying the overseer's habits, noticing that he developed a pattern of drinking heavily on certain nights, specifically the nights before shipments were scheduled. On those evenings, his attention slackened and his capacity to supervise diminished. Ezekiel, meanwhile, charted alternate routes through the woods that skirted the property line, identifying which creek beds dried during the late summer heat, which patches of brush could conceal movement even under moonlight. The two brothers compared notes in whispers, ensuring that their steps matched not just in intention, but in sequence. They knew that their bond could save them, but only if their planning respected the harsh realities of the terrain and the system keeping them bound. Throughout this preparation, an unexpected source of support came from an elderly woman named Aunt Liddy, who had lived on the plantation longer than anyone could remember. She moved slowly, spoke rarely, and saw everything. Though she never asked for details, she recognized in the twins the same burning that had once lived in her own son, before he had been sold. One evening, while the quarters prepared for sleep and the overseer remained shut away in his cabin, she approached the twins with a small cloth bundle. Inside was a strip of dried bark, a small vial of salve, and a piece of charcoal wrapped in linen. She spoke only a few words, that the bark would help with fever, the salve with wounds, and the charcoal could mark trees quietly if they needed to find each other in darkness. It was not permission she offered, nor blessing, only acknowledgement, the kind that said, "I see what you are preparing for, and I will not stand in your way." That silent alliance, one formed not by words, but by understanding, gave the twins a sense of grounding. They were no longer acting alone, even if you knew the full truth of their intentions. Their escape, should it succeed, would not be theirs alone. It would be a ripple of defiance against the system that had taken their mother. And if it failed, their attempt would still exist as testimony proof that they had not accepted the fate forced upon them. As late summer turned toward early autumn, the nights grew cooler, and with that chill came a moment the twins had been waiting for. The plantation was preparing for a major shipment to be sent toward the river the same direction, where the rumors placed their mother. The overseer, as Elias had predicted, drank heavily the night before the shipment's departure. The patrollers, fatigued from days of preparation, were fewer in number and slower in vigilance, and the moon, veiled by thin clouds, cast only the faintest of light. It was the closest thing to alignment the twins had yet seen. They exchanged a look in the quarters that not a silent agreement forged through years of shared breath, shared pain, shared purpose. They did not need to speak. They had reached the edge of planning. The next steps would be taken with their bodies, their courage, and the memory of their mother guiding them forward. And as they lay down in the cramped sleeping space, waiting for the plantation to fall fully into the kind of uneasy silence that precedes bold action, each brother felt the same quiet realization settle over him, that whatever waited in the darkness, beyond the property line danger, discovery, hope, reunion, death, it was closer than it had ever been, and they were ready to step toward it. The months that followed unfolded like a long, bruised breath held inside the body, a stretch of time where every day felt both fragile and sharpened with purpose. As the twins pushed deeper into the world of quiet defiance that now defined their existence, their mother's absence had become not a wound that closed, but an open space that shaped their decisions. Every step they took was measured against the memory of the woman who had once cupped their faces in her hands and told them that survival was not the end goal, dignity was. Her teachings did not fade, but grew louder in the silence she left behind, guiding them through the coded network of enslaved people who traded whispers like currency and used memory like a map to chart paths toward safety, justice, or simply small victories that made another day possible. The plantation around them lived on in its usual violence and routines, but the twins had learned that beneath any structure of oppression existed a hidden layer of resistance, some quiet, some trembling with risk, and they moved now with the awareness that the world they inhabited had two surfaces, like a river whose calm top concealed a deeper, faster current beneath. They had stepped into that undercurrent fully, and once inside it, they understood that returning to the surface was no longer an option. Their secret lessons with a literate field hand continued in shadow corners and moon-washed nights, and the knowledge they gained became a lifeline, an instrument of quiet rebellion that reshaped how they interpreted every cruel command and every small opportunity for leverage. Reading, once nothing more than lines of symbols that locked them out, became a blade, precise and bright. They had learned not only letters, but the structure of contracts, the language of ownership, the way men with power justified cruelty behind words that twisted logic into law. They saw, with growing clarity, how the world had been designed to make their suffering appear natural, ordained, permanent. And once they understood the design, the illusion weakened. The overseer's threats became less terrifying when the twins realized his authority existed only because men above him insisted on maintaining the system that fed them wealth. The plantation owner's ledger, once a mysterious book of numbers and names, transformed into a record of how human lives were counted, priced, and traded like livestock. This knowledge, dangerous, forbidden, was not just information. It was a new way of seeing, a vantage point from which the twins began to interpret every injustice as something constructed by human hands, and therefore something that could, one day, be unmade. Their defiance remained careful, nearly invisible at first, though the overseer began to sense a change he could not name. The youths, who once bent their heads in submission, now carried themselves with a quiet, unsettling steadiness. They completed their tasks, remained outwardly obedient, but there was a deliberateness to their movements, a lack of fear in their eyes that irritated him, though he could not articulate why. It was the beginning of tension that would eventually spark open conflict, but for now, the twins observed, learned, and waited. They had discovered a pattern in the overseer's routines, the predictable cruelty of a man who believed himself unquestioned and supreme. He drank bourbon at dusk until his hands shook. He rode the fields every morning in the same order, and he kept his keys hooked at his belt at all times. These observations were not idle curiosities. They were notes in a growing inventory the twins kept quietly in their minds, the type of inventory people kept when preparing for something larger than a single act of defiance. Meanwhile, the stories traded among the enslaved community grew bolder as winter approached, the cold sharpening memories and ambitions alike. People spoke of uprisings in whispers too low for white ears to detect, but loud enough that anyone listening carefully could sense the rumbling of something long suppressed. Tales of Denmark Vessie's thwarted rebellion years earlier drifted again through the cabins, not as stories of defeat, but as reminders that resistance did not die simply because one attempt was crushed. The twins absorbed these stories like scripture. They began to realize they were not alone in their anger, nor were they the only ones who felt the weight of a mother ripped from her children, or a family torn apart. Across the plantation, grief and rage lived inside nearly every person, simmering, waiting. The twins understood then that their path forward was not merely personal. It was part of a collective yearning that pulsed through the cabins at night, a longing for freedom so deep it felt like a second heartbeat. Their connection to their mother felt strangely stronger during these months, as though losing her had awakened parts of themselves that had been dormant. They remembered the way she used to hum at dusk, the melody simple but steady, a sound that had once felt like background air, but now returned to them at odd moments, while hauling water, while cleaning tools, while watching the overseer ride his rounds. The tune became a private ritual between the twins, each humming it softly when the other faltered. It grounded them, reminded them that they carried within them not just her blood, but her defiance. She had been taken, but the threads of her strength remained. Sometimes they wondered if she knew, wherever she had been sent, that her children were not broken, that her absence had not hollowed them, but transformed them into something sharper, more resolute. They hoped she did die as winter deepened, so did their resolve. Their reading lessons expanded into discussions of maps, geography, and the whispered routes many enslaved people attempted to follow toward freedom. Though escape had never been their first intention, their loyalty to their mother held them. Tethered to finding her, they began to realize that understanding these routes provided both tactical advantage and emotional clarity. In learning the pathways carved by fugitives over the years, they came to see just how vast the network of resistance truly was. Stretching far beyond the boundaries of the plantation, people had been fighting in shadows for generations, leaving markers in trees, signals in quilts, songs encoded with direction. The twins began memorizing these signs not because they planned to flee tomorrow, but because the knowledge itself felt like reclaiming a piece of the world that had been denied to them. Knowing the way north was an act of ownership over their own fate, even if they chose not to follow that direction immediately. Yet beneath the slow accumulation of knowledge and strategy, there was still the raw grief of not knowing their mother's fate. Some nights, the longing for her presence felt almost unbearable, a weight pressing down on their chests until breathing itself felt like struggle. These moments of vulnerability did not weaken them, but reminded them why they could not falter. They knew that somewhere, perhaps not far, their mother endured her own daily fight to survive, and they believed because they had to that she held onto the hope her children were still out there, searching for a path back to her. This belief became a lantern in their darkest moments, a glow that refused to extinguish even when despair crept close. Then came a turning point so subtle at first that they did not realize its significance. A new arrival at the plantation, a woman brought from a neighboring estate, who carried with her details about other farms, other sales, including a description of a woman taken months earlier who matched their mother's height and features. The information was incomplete, fragmented, but it contained a direction southwest and the name of the trader who had facilitated the sale. It was the first concrete thread the twins had received, and its arrival felt like fate shifting slightly in their favor. With this new detail, their quiet planning sharpened into purpose. The world that once felt impenetrable now contained a small crack, just wide enough to glimpse possibility beyond the walls of the plantation. They continued gathering information, never revealing to anyone exactly what they intended. Understanding that secrets kept people alive, their resistance grew increasingly intentional, each day adding a new piece to the quiet architecture of their emerging plan. They watched, they waited, and slowly they prepared. And with winter slowly giving way to the first hints of spring, they sensed the moment approaching, the moment when all their silent work, all their patient accumulation of knowledge, all their grief-hardened resolve would converge into action. The twins knew that the world would not grant them justice. Justice would have to be claimed. They were ready. The years that followed did not erase the scars carved into the lives of the Carolina twins, but time gave them a strange, solemn clarity and understanding of what had been taken and what they had reclaimed through resistance. After the dust of their final stand settled, after the fields emptied of their cries and the overseer's shouts faded into mere memory, the twins stepped into a world still ruled by chains, but no longer able to fully contain them. Freedom had not arrived as a document or decree. It arrived as a stubborn, unbreakable truth inside them, a truth that no master, no traitor, no law could extinguish. They carried the weight of what they had done, every act of defiance, every risk, every moment they chose to fight rather than surrender, and that weight became a kind of shield, a testament to their mother's blood still running fiercely through their veins. They knew that survival alone was not victory, but surviving with purpose, surviving with dignity, surviving with memory. This was the closest thing to triumph that the brutal world of 1829 allowed them dot in the quiet spaces between labor. The twins would recall their mother's voice, not the exact words, for those had blurred with time, but the shape of her strength, the way she had moved through the world with a calm fury, as though she understood that her children were watching and learning lessons they would one day need. They had once feared her memory would fade into the same silence that swallowed so many enslaved lives, but instead, every step they took in defiance renewed her presence, even in the harshest moments. When the threat of the slave catcher's return hovered like a storm waiting to break open the sky, the twins found power in refusing to let her legacy be erased. They understood now that the rebellion they carried was not simply against their master or the institution that claimed to own them. It was against the forgetting, against the way slavery tried to hollow people out and leave them as shadows of themselves. By remembering her, they resisted the very mechanism meant to annihilate their lineage. In the broader world, outside the plantation borders, whispers of their actions traveled in the slow, coded language of the enslaved. Stories shifted as they moved, reshaped by distance and fear and admiration. Yet they all converged on the same truth. The Carolina twins were no longer merely boys born into bondage, but symbols of a quieter, sharper kind of rebellion. Some said they confronted the overseer directly, others that they orchestrated escapes, others still that they exposed corruption among traders who trafficked children like livestock. The exact details mattered little. What mattered was the rising belief that power could be disrupted from within, that even those born with nothing could strike a blow small, subtle, but deeply felt against the machinery that ground their families into dust. The plantation owners dismissed the rumors as nonsense, insisting that the twins were just laborers who had misunderstood their place. But the enslaved knew better. They recognized bravery not in grand gestures, but in the persistent refusal to bow fully, to become what was expected. And in that recognition, the twins found a community of quiet allies, people who helped shield them, warn them, guide them through dangers that lurked behind every rule they bent out as the seasons changed. The landscape around them became a living record of their journey. The riverbank where they once listened to their mother's stories became their sanctuary again. The old oaks where they had hidden from the overseer became markers of their endurance. Even the fields where their backs had bent and burned beneath the relentless sun carried new meaning, not because the suffering had lessened, but because they now moved through those rows with the knowledge that the system meant to break them had failed. Hardship continued, punishment remained a constant threat, but their spirits no longer trembled before it. There was a steadiness to them, a kind of quiet fire that no one could explain, but everyone could feel. Those who worked beside them sensed something different, something forged in pain yet sharpened by purpose, and this presence alone became its own form of protection.